I'm Greg from Pedro's Santa Maria Style Barbecue. Today we're going to prep our tri-tip for the grill. So the first question to answer is, what is tri-tip? Tri-tip is a cut of beef that originated, much like we did, in the central coast of California, in the Santa Maria Valley, in the middle of last century. We'll start by pointing out where on the cow a tri-tip comes from and what type of meat it is. So our art department put together this wonderful diagram, specifically my daughter Nola. Before the cut of tri-tip was invented, people in the central coast of California would use pit grills or just open pits with Central Coast red oak or coastal oak as it's called, and they would cook on spits or over moving trays top sirloin, which comes from this part of the cow right here. But in 1956, at a Safeway in Santa Maria, California, a one-armed butcher named Bob Schultz decided to take this meat right here, the bottom sirloin, rather than just grind it up for hamburger or sausage, to in fact cut it in half into two triangles and call it tri-tip. And then he cooked it over an open pit grill over oak. He added some garlic and pepper-based seasoning, and thus tri-tip was born. Since then, since the middle of last century, 1956 to be precise, Santa Maria style tri-tip has increased greatly in popularity. Myself and my two brothers, Dave and Chris, we were taught by our parents, by our grandparents, and by many of our friends on the Central Coast how to cook tri-tip. So today, we're going to prep a tri-tip, and then we're going to cook it, and then we're going to cut it. Let's start with the tools that you're going to need. First of all, have a nice place to hold your meat. If you are cooking for some place where you're going to serve the public, you have to keep the meat below 42 degrees. If you're just feeding your family at home, I recommend let it get pretty close to room temperature before you get it on the grill. That'll make it a little bit easier to cook. But once again, if you're going to serve the public, and what we do when we serve the public, we keep it cold, below 42 degrees. Other tools you're going to need, I always recommend when you're handling meat, whether you're prepping it or cutting it, to have a cookie sheet down, and then whatever pan you're going to dry rub the meat in, or whatever cutting board you're going to cut the meat on, have that inside the cookie sheet. Tri-tip's a big thick piece of meat, has a lot of blood in it. That's what gives it some great flavor and its juiciness later once you've cooked it. But that blood's going to go everywhere. That's why a nice half-inch cookie sheet where you have the cutting board inside it that you cut on that is the best way to do it. So let's have another conversation. You will often go to the meat department of your grocery store and see them offering both trimmed and untrimmed tri-tip. Trimmed tri-tip is generally going to cost you $2 to $3 more. And so let's talk about what that is. Really, it's the same cut of meat, just your butcher put more work into it. For a trimmed piece of tri-tip, this is an untrimmed piece of tri-tip, the butcher will take his knife and he'll cut this piece of fat off right here, and then he'll cut this fat off the bottom right here, and at the very tip, he'll cut this fat off right here. Now, when you eat our product at a farmer's market somewhere here on the Kitsap Peninsula in Washington, we're going to cook it untrimmed. We're going to leave all the fat on there, and then it'll cook on the fat. And then once we take it off, we'll carve whatever fat is left after the flames have gotten to it and serve it to you that way. That's how we recommend getting your tri-tip. Don't pay the butcher that extra money to trim it, especially if you're going to cook it in a smoker, or you're going to cook it on a pit grill, you're going to cook it in something like a green egg. Anything where you can control the separation of the flames and the meat, you're better off with untrimmed tri-tip. That fat's just going to make your meat juicier. Now, the exception to that is this. If you're going to cook on a gas grill, where you're going to have roughly 6 to 10 inches of separation between your flame and your meat, and you can't really control that, you're going to want to use trimmed tri-tip at that point, because the alternative, if you tried to cook an untrimmed tri-tip on a gas grill, what would happen is the tri-tip will catch on fire when the fat ignites. That's A, unsafe, and B, it's just going to make bad meat. So unless you're cooking on a gas grill, don't pay the butcher extra. Leave the fat on there. Cook it fat side down for the majority of the time. We'll talk about that later. And leave the fat on. If you're cooking on a gas grill, pay the butcher a little bit extra to cut it off, or buy it and cut it yourself. So what we're going to do here to start is we're going to take our tri-tip and we're going to season it. Now, we use a family recipe seasoning. You can see it right in front of us. What are some of the things that are in it? Well, the first thing that's in it is a lot of garlic salt, a little bit of pepper. We like onion salt as well. I think it's best said that in cooking, garlic tastes great, but onion tastes a little bit better. And if you go with onion salt to garlic salt, roughly an even ratio, you're going to get a good flavor. The other thing we put in there, but I advise you, just like with our garlic bread, to be careful with, is a little bit of Italian seasoning, but you don't want a lot. Another thing you want a little bit of, but not a lot, is just a little bit of sugar. But once again, not a lot. You put too much sugar in there, you ruin it, it tastes horrible. Okay, we have a couple other things in there. I'm not going to give you the portions because my Grandpa Tilly, whose recipe this is, would be mad at me from somewhere up in heaven. So I can't tell you the exact portion. But it's going to look something like this. And I'll do you another favor. If you don't want to experiment and make your own, if you use the Suzy Q brand, you can look them up on the internet. They're owned by the Righetti family, who also owns the Far Western Tavern in Santa Maria, California. Theirs is excellent. We use theirs all the time, but we prefer ours. So to season our tri-tip, or to put the dry rub on our tri-tip, what we'll do is, I don't always use a shaker, sometimes we do, but if in this case we don't have a shaker, I'll just put a little bit of it in my hand, and I have a glass tray here, and I have a cookie dish underneath it in case I spill, and then just rub it in there. Get in, and the big places you want to see it is on the meat. Let me show you something that'll come in handy later when we're cutting this piece of meat. If you notice on the tri-tip, and it's probably easier to see when it's raw, the grains of the tri-tip, they turn as with the piece of meat. So the grain is something like this at the start, and then it turns this way. So that's something important to remember for when we're cutting it later. But for now, I'll put a little bit of the dry rub seasoning on here, and then I'll press it into the meat. Want to make sure I get it on the cap here. And I want more of it on the top than on the bottom, because remember, the top, this meat here, you're actually going to be eating it. On the very bottom, this fat here, or what is mostly fat here, most of that's going to burn off while you're cooking. So we want a little bit of it on there for sure, but that's probably never going to hit the people eating its mouth, because most of that's going to burn off. So I'm going to get it spread on there. I'm going to get it rubbed in good. Make sure you get it on the sides as well. Get a good amount of it on there. I have my dry rub on my tri-tip. I'm going to put it in whatever container I'm going to take it to the grill in, and then it's going to be ready to grill. A couple things to talk about. One, that's a 24-hour thing at most. Once you put the dry rub on your tri-tip, you got about 24 hours to cook it. The salt and stuff that's in there is not going to be good for the meat longer than about 24 hours. So our thought on that is we prep it roughly 3 to 4 hours before market if we can. Sometimes we do it right at the market and throw it right on the grill. But that's the way we like to do it, to keep a minimal amount of time between getting the dry rub on the tri-tip and then getting the tri-tip on the grill. And then make sure you store it in a fridge, or never let it get any hotter than room temperature before you put it on the grill. So these are the tools we're going to use while we have our meat on the grill. First, best I know, this is a Santa Maria Original, the pigtail. This allows us to grab the meat and flip it on the grill. Very effective tool. We use 3 different sets of tongs because we want to have a set of tongs for each type of food that we're cooking on the grill. We don't want to cross-contaminate there. So I use this tong for cooking linguiça sausage. We use these tongs for moving around our tri-tip if we need to. And we use these tongs for our bread. Then finally, we take a knife to the grill in case we need to cut any burnt edges off or something like that. Last thing you're going to have is a good steel pot that you can set on the grill. We'll talk more about that later. For our fire, we use 2 types of wood. We use red oak from California. You can see it's got a bit of that red. It's got the bit of that red color. You can see it's got the thick bark on there. And because we don't have an endless supply of that here in Washington like we did in California, we use this lighter oak that comes from Southern Oregon, or from, pardon me, Northern Oregon and Southern Washington. It burns really well. We like it quite a bit. In fact, if we had our choice, we would do what we do now, where we mix this Washington and Oregon white oak with the California red oak. What you get is you get the nice, clean, hot burn of the oak from from further north, and then you get that nice smoke and flavor from the Central Coast red oak. So our fire's burning to a point where it's right at the bottom of the grill. That's where we want it. From there, we'll go up 3 or 4 turns, get a good separation of 3 to 4 inches from the top of the flames. That's my technique. Some people will prefer, especially if they have more time and it's warmer outside, to cook it really low and slow, where you have just coals that you're cooking it over, and you keep the tray generally pretty low. Because we're typically cooking for time, we're going to cook over open flame, and we're going to keep the tray kind of high. Okay, so we're going to put our meat on the grill fat side down. So this side here that has all the fat, that side's going to go down. And I generally like to put all of mine, in the same direction. Looking at the size of our pieces of tri-tip, I want to put the thickest and fattest ones on the inside and the thinnest and skinniest ones on the outside. So I've got these 2 thin ones on the outside, the 3 thick ones on the inside. Now, the first thing, 2 things I'm going to do as soon as I put my meat on the grill. First thing, I'm going to look at my watch. Second thing is, I'm going to take my thermometer out and get a good idea of where we're starting, temperature-wise, on our meat. As a general rule of thumb, we cook our meat fat down. We cook our meat 3 to 4 inches off the top of the flames. I can control that by A, the amount of wood that I have on the fire and how I manipulate the fire, and B, by moving the crank to move the tray up and down. So how long does a tri-tip take to cook? There's a couple factors that play into that. One, the outside air temperature. A day like today, it's about 50 degrees here in Washington. It's gonna be a little slower. Beautiful summer day where it's 80 degrees, it's gonna be a little faster. As a general rule of thumb, big picture, 75 minutes for a tri-tip is a good number. That means you're not having to cook it too fast. If you have to cook fast, you can get it down to as low as 45 to 50, and there's some tricks for that which we can show you. Also, how am I going to cook it? It's going to be about 2/3 with the fat side down, this side right here that has all the fat on it, and about 1/3 on the top where it's mostly meat with just a little bit of skin and fat. As a general rule of thumb, I use 20-10, 20-10, 10-5. 20 minutes on the fat side, 10 minutes on the top, 20 minutes on the fat side, 10 minutes on the top, 10 minutes on the fat side, and then the last 5 minutes cooking it on the top. You can't leave it exclusively on the fat side and expect it to cook up all the way through, because what would happen is the bottom of the tri-tip would burn and the top would be underdone. Another thing to keep in mind with your tri-tip, when you're measuring the temperature, you want to measure the temperature right here in the middle. That's what you're aiming for. You're aiming for 130 degrees right here in the middle, because the tips are going to cook more. That's going to be your well done meat. But the fat part in the middle is what you want to get to 130 degrees, that beautiful medium rare. But you want to make sure that you're sticking it right there in the middle, and you want to make sure that you're not putting holes all over your meat and letting all the juice drain out. So probably just one point where you're going to stick it with the thermometer, and then I like to use this little piece of fat on the end to be the point where I grab it with the pigtail. We're about 12 to 15 minutes into our grill right now. It's only gained about 15 to 20 degrees of temperature internally to the meat. But once we flip it over, we have to be very careful because there's not a lot of fat on the top side. So you're cooking directly on the meat. So it's kind of like if you were cooking a traditional ribeye or some other steak, you don't want to burn it. What we're looking for before we flip it back over is for it to get just a little bit darker on the top, and then we'll flip it back over and let it do some serious work cooking with the fat side down. Now on that first flip, it's only going to have gained about 15 to 20 degrees of internal temperature. And then once we flip it back over, we're going to be about 30 degrees above where we started. So we're about 66 minutes in. Our smallest tri-tip is, I believe, done. At least he feels done. We'll get the thermometer in there. 131 degrees, that's perfect. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to take him off. I'm going to put him in our pot. The pot's going to sit on the edge of the grill, and he's going to sit there. You need at least 10 to 15 minutes of your tri-tip sitting before you cut it. So those first tri-tip off the grill, they'll just sit in the pot and be happy. They'll firm up so we can carve them nicely. So as we're finishing off these last 3 tri-tip, one thing to note is we've maxed out our time that we're going to cook these things on the top. If you notice, like I said earlier, we got to protect the meat on the top. What you want to avoid is creating a shell where you burn the meat on the top of the tri-tip. So for all 3 of these tri-tip, I've cooked them as much on the top as I'm going to cook them. You can see off my thermometer, I'm about 125 degrees. That last 5 degrees is going to have to come from cooking from the bottom because I'm not willing to burn the top. You might find yourself in this situation. Don't worry, you'll get that last 4 or 5 degrees. It's better that way, taking a little bit longer than burning the top. Okay, now we're going to cut our tri-tip. Believe it or not, the texture of your tri-tip, the way it eats, is as much dependent on how you cut it as how you cook it. So we're going to reach in our pot, grab one of our tri-tips. We've let them sit in the pot no less than 10 minutes. They need to firm up after you grill them. I like to use tongs. You can also use your hand to hold the tri-tip while you cut it. I like to use a cutting board inside a cookie sheet. That way it captures all the juice that's gonna come out of the tri-tip when I cut it, and that juice is not gonna get all over me, get all over the floor, get all over our table. So first thing we need to do is look at each individual tri-tip and figure out where the grain on the tri-tip is. The way I see the grain on this tri-tip is it's basically going this way with a little bit of curve. So with most tri-tips, they're gonna be shaped roughly like this when they come off the grill. First thing I'm gonna do is cut that thing in half. And then I'm gonna stand it on its edge, and if I have any extra fat on the bottom, I'm gonna cut that off. This one really doesn't. And then from there, for the bottom half, the half that's gonna come off roughly square, I'm not gonna cut it this way. I'm not gonna cut it towards me. Instead, what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna cut it from the edge in. That's gonna ensure that I'm cutting it across the grain. Okay, the grain is going this way. I wanna cut it this way. Okay, I'm gonna finish cutting my tri-tip. I generally like somewhere around 1/4 inch thick slices of tri-tip. Then once I've cut my tri-tip, I'll have some place to put it. You know, when we're running a market or an event, we'll generally be putting it in a warming dish. If you're about to take it inside and serve it, I recommend some kind of Pyrex dish that you can cover with foil just to keep it warm. Because once you cut it, it's gonna dissipate heat rapidly. The tri-tips are whole, they hold their heat pretty well and they'll hold warm for quite a while. Once you cut them, I'd say you have at most about 10 minutes to get that served unless you can put it on some sort of warming dish. So to make the perfect tri-tip sandwich like we do at Pedro's Santa Maria Style Barbecue, we'll take our piece of bread, we'll grab a piece of tri-tip, center it on the bread. If you notice, we want the width of the bread to be roughly exactly what the width of the tri-tip is. Take a little bit of our salsa. A heaping tablespoon works pretty well. You want to cover the meat, but you don't want to let too much of the juice soak into the bread, just a little bit. And then there you have it. You have your tri-tip with your homemade salsa on your grilled garlic bread. Add it up, and there's the perfect tri-tip sandwich.